sure that running through the papers this morning, it confirmed my suspicions that it was indeed the Doolittle budget. Martin Wolf, I thought, wrote a very interesting article in the Financial Times. And what I say, I suspect a lot of you are already fully aware of, but nevertheless, I will do it just to paint the picture for the rest of the morning. To start with the economic forecast, which is not in this chart, it was quite interesting. As Alistair Darling was talking about it, he confirmed that we'd get perhaps 1 to 1.5% growth this year, which I think we regard as reasonably plausible. And then he said with terrific sort of prescience, you know, that well, he's going to revise down the growth for next year, but he still has it at about 3.25%, which I think a lot of people regard as optimistic. I think the City's looking for 2.5% for 2011, and then he was back to his trajectory of 3.5% for 2012 onwards. And I think it is a general consensus that these figures are really far too optimistic. And as you look at the breakdown as to where he's going to get this growth from, he's relying very much on a really big bounce back in business investment for not just 2011, but particularly 2012. Well, if you're not going to get the sort of growth that we think is likely, it's very unlikely you'll get that real bounce back in business investment. Because after all, business investment tends to lag growth rather than actually lead it. But very, very optimistic on business investment, and they're also very optimistic, I think, on the possible net contribution on the balance of trade with, again, very buoyant export figures. And of course, we know the consequences if these GDP figures are undershot, is that the public finances will turn out even worse than already projected in the budget. Which leads me on to the public finances. Again, I thought Alistair Darling spoke with some piety, if I may say so, that because of their great policies, the borrowing wasn't going to look quite as bad as it had done at the time of the pre-budget report. And indeed, he found 11 billion cut in the borrowing requirement for financial year 2009. And so we all sat there going, 178 minus 11 is 167. My God, that's still a very big figure. And of course, as a percentage of GDP, it had dropped from 12.6% to 11.8%. And this somehow was meant to be on the road to some sort of economic nirvana. Well, maybe not. No, come on, definitely not. And there was some shaving down of the borrowing figures. I mean, I worked in the Treasury, I know what forecasting is like. You have a figure there, you have a figure there, and you put figures in between. It's called interpolation. I'm cynical because I was in the civil service for far too long. I was in the Treasury far too long, I suspect. But, I mean, joking apart, when you actually looked, of course he's talking about all these savings on borrowing, which of course are completely mythical as far as I'm concerned, not least of all because of the GDP figures. But you still talking, you add the figures up, you're still talking about extra borrowing of 660 billion financial year 2009 to financial year 2013. And you're still talking about debt going up nearly to 1.5 trillion by 2013 and then into 2014, which is still 75% of GDP, even on these curious projections of GDP. I think these numbers are still horrendous, quite honestly. And he was talking, of course, about his Fiscal Consolidation Act. The bill became an act in February when it got its royal assent, and saying, of course, that by 2013 or whatever, then the borrowing as a percentage of GDP, if you note, will have halved. So they've gone down from 11.8% in 2009 to 5.2% in financial year 2013. Well, 5.2%, if I may say so, is still remarkably high after a period of, 4 or 5 years of fiscal consolidation, and much higher than the Maastricht criterion, just 3%, which countries like Portugal, Ireland, Spain and Greece are meant to be hitting in not 2013, I think meant to in 2012. So it's no wonder that the Commission wrapped the government's knuckles for their weak fiscal consolidation programme. But of course we know it's not just what has been happening with the Commission. The IMF has criticised the slowness of the fiscal consolidation, and indeed so have the ratings agencies. I mean, the ratings agencies have been making noises about this really ever since the last budget. Last May, I think it was that one of the ratings agencies, Standard & Poor's, downgraded the outlook for British sovereign debt and they've been muttering ever since, as far as I can see. And as far as I can see with you, there's an article in the FT some weeks ago which suggests that given that our yield on 10-year gilts is now knocking on for 4%, that in fact we really don't justify our AAA rating at all. But the ratings agencies have been sort of sitting on their hands about doing the final deed of downgrading the debt. I mean, it's as if they are waiting, obviously, they're waiting till next election and the new government, whatever its political cue may do. In other words, our rating for gilts, for sovereign debt, is very much on probation. And I suppose the mood in the gilts markets was not helped by one Bill Gross, who's the managing director of PIMCO, who not just pulled out of gilts, but actually made a very rude remark that British gilts were resting on a bed of nitroglycerin, which was quite a flamboyant speech and probably slightly over the top, but I suspect he was trying to say something that was helpful to the policymakers in this country. And it did amuse me that when you look at PIMCO, it is one Andrew Balls, who is Ed Balls' brother, who is the head of PIMCO's European portfolio. But so we know that there are still great risks over British sovereign debt. The second thing I would like to say is really about this. It's quite obvious to you here, and I suspect it's the view of the TPA, if I may say so, that clearly fiscal consolidation needs to be quicker. But what did we hear yesterday? Over and over and over again, Alistair Darling made the point that if you start cutting spending quicker and faster now, then you would actually threaten the recovery. But well, of course, it's just one aspect of what is happening in the wider economy, and a bigger aspect for me is the fact that when you do have this bed of nitroglycerin, then if you are going to be selling all these gilts into the market, inevitably those bond yields have to stay relatively high, if not increase. And we all know that as interest rates increase, and these are the real interest rates when you're talking about lending, not the Bank of England's bank rate, then of course that tends to choke off recovery as well. But it is interesting how, well, why should I say it's interesting? It's inevitable that politicians do have their own sort of prism through which they analyse the more speedy fiscal consolidation. Obviously, I believe very strongly that we should go for it. I think my final comment really will be, why haven't we had a comprehensive spending review to date for financial year 2011 to 2013? Alistair Darling tells us that this is because the economy is uncertain. Well, come on, I mean, I don't really think that's a reason. And I was very struck by quite a few comments in the FT this morning, how this really was rather remiss. Of course we should have had a comprehensive spending review, and then you could have seen the consequences of even Alistair Darling's programme of fiscal consolidation on the departments, the implications for the departments. And I was looking at some IFS analysis just after the PBR, and what they were doing, they took the debt interest, which is set to rise from 30 billion for 2008 up to about 70 billion for 2014. And they took the other aspects of what is known as annually managed expenditure, like social security payments, payments to the European Union, which is one of my little favourites, and indeed public sector pensions. And when you've allowed for those components of AME, which are set to grow very quickly and quicker than average, then the money that is left for the departments from 2011 to 2013 is essentially flat in cash terms. So in real terms, you're talking about a 3% fall for the departments. And when you actually allow for the protected departments like health, schools, Sure Start, the aid budget, and all those things, then the IFS calculated that the other departments like Home Office, Justice, Defence, Transport, I mean the capital expenditure is going to get absolutely decimated by this, money for potholes or not, which as I tripped over a few potholes this morning is near to my heart. But you looked at all these department spending and they calculated that these particular departments would be facing real terms cuts of about 6 or 7% per annum over that period. Is Alistair Darling seriously trying to tell us that you can do this without cutting back on the services? Well, I really don't think so. But more to the point, I would have loved to have heard him actually discuss some of this and the consequences for some of these departments, these inevitable consequences, even on his own projections, rather than hear some of the waffle we heard yesterday. But of course, that is not what we tend to hear when we're just going into an election. So at that point, I will finish.
That's it.
Thank you.